Let's get started creating the last project type inside the web application for .NET Core, and that's the API. So we're going to select ASP.NET Core Web Application, hit Next. Let's call this the API app, and we'll call this the API application. I hit Create, and we're going to select API. We'll leave all the rest of the settings the same. Make sure it's .NET Core 2.2. And hit Create. All right, that was quick. Done 1.62 seconds. It's gotten a lot faster to load templates and their dependencies. So this is a little bit more trimmed down. It doesn't have all the web stuff that we're kind of used to as far as the www root or the pages you might have, because it really is just controllers. That's it. So if you create an API project on its own, it has no web UI. It just has the controllers. So before we even start here, let's launch this. So once this builds and launches it, let's see what we get. That's it. The default is actually to take us to /API/values, which is actually the same default path that ASP.NET or Web API has in the full .NET framework. It's just that it also has MVC along with it. This does not have MVC along with it unless you want it. So right now it sends us to API/values, which returns those two values. So let's look at what that actually is. So first of all, startup. We scroll down. There's not much in here because it's just the basics of API itself. So in here, how do we know where to go? Well, it says right away, it says the route is API/ and then square brackets controller. So this is kind of a way to not hard code a route, but instead allow the route to change if you change the name of the controller. So if I change this value controller over to be my controller, the route is now my. So API/my/ and that'd be it, would be just this get call. And then we have the other actions as well. So we have, this is an API controller. So we have get, and that gets us all the values. So value 1, value 2. Get with an ID passed in, which comes across in the route. And that gets us a return value of just value. It's not actually using that ID. We'll modify that. And then we have post from body, we have a put, and we have a delete. So this is kind of our sample to kind of show us the different things we can do and how it might look. So with a value controller, it's /values. Let's create a new controller. Add controller. We're going to create an API controller. And let's create an API controller with, let's just create blank and we'll copy over. So we'll create empty and we'll create this. We'll say, let's do more info. So more info controller, which means /more info, will get us the get command. So we have the same structure here. So the API / a controller name, and then it's an API controller. It inherits from controller base. So we just bring in this get command, just so we have something to start with. Actually, let's create these two. And we'll actually modify it in the more info controller, just so you can kind of see how this might look. So the get command is the default command when we call on the URL. And that's because web pages, when we put a URL in the address bar and hit enter, it makes a get command. That's an HTTP verb. So it's get, post, put, delete, and there's some other ones, but those are the major ones. So that corresponds then to this name, HTTP get, although we're also specifying up here saying this is a get command. So it's going to return an action result. This is kind of nice, an action result. And that allows us to return, not found, which would return a 404 or other things. But it also it's a generic, so it specifies the type of data we'll return if it's a valid result. Meaning I just return right here a new string array and it says, okay, yep, I can do that. And the action result, it'll kind of wrap that in a 200 message, which means success. So it's doing a lot of stuff for us with its action result without us having to do anything. So that's kind of nice. So let's change this a little bit. Let's just return instead of value 1, value 2. This is info 1 and info 2. How creative. Let's do one more. There you go. How creative. So that's the get command. But what if we pass an ID in? Well, let's modify that so it actually does something besides just return value. And let's put a $sign in front here and say your ID is, and just pass it right back. Just so we can see that it's actually reading it in and using it. So now I can run this. And once it launches, we'll be able to call the more info controller. So API / more info. And now we see, it's kind of small. Let's zoom in here. Info 1, info 2, and how creative. What if I pass in /5 at the end? Now it says your ID is 5. That's because it reads the URL and says, oh, you're passing an ID in, therefore you match this route right here because it has an ID being passed in and it matches up to the integer ID. So that's how the API works. Very, very simple. You have your different verb commands. You have your get, your post, your put, and your delete, the common ones you'll use. And you can pass information in. Like here it's passing in an ID for put, which maps to here. But then it's also from the body getting this string value. So it's reading that from the body of the command as well. We're not going to get into how to make that call. That's kind of outside the scope of this video. But just know that's how you do it. Again, post from body and delete, you pass in just an ID. So it's kind of model it for you how it might work. Now, by default, the way they set up the routes is API / the controller, just like we would do in a web API project in the full .NET framework. So it's very, very similar to how that would work. It's just that this is stupid simple. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot to learn still, and yes, it can be confusing. But compared to the full web API, this is much, much more simplified and streamlined. You just have controllers. That's it. Create your controller, whatever you name your controller, take off controller, and that's the route. Okay? Very, very straightforward and streamlined. You really only have to live inside this controllers folder. The rest of the stuff is pretty much you leave it alone. Unless you're going to tweak some configuration. And we'll cover the configuration in a future video in this course. So that's Web API. Actually, that's API in .NET Core, not Web API. Web API is most commonly associated with the full .NET framework. So this is just API in .NET Core. In the next video, we're going to cover what the differences are and when to use each different type. The web application, which is the Razor views, the MVC, and the API.